Have you ever created a roof in Valheim and found yourself wondering, how do I add one of those cool Viking roof thingies? In this video, I'm going to show you the 2 steps that you need to know to add a Viking roof thingy. I mean a Viking roof peak to your roof in Valheim. Let's do it. Step number 1, choosing the shape. Now before you can choose the shape, you'll want to line the roof you are working with angled beams. Once you do that, there are 3 things that will help you choose the shape of your Viking roof peak. These 3 things will be used in combination with one another to create the basic shape, but before that we need to talk about them individually. First, you will have to choose where along the edge of your roof that your Viking roof peak will begin. The more you go outwards, the larger your Viking roof peak will be. If you can't decide where to place your Viking roof peak, then I recommend placing it one angled beam from the outside edge of your roof. This separates the Viking roof peak from the original roof by one diagonal beam, which makes it easier to understand visually. Second, now that you have chosen your place to begin, you will have to determine which angled beams you will attach to this point. If you use more 45-degree angled beams, then the Viking roof peak will be taller, and more 26-degree angled beams, then the Viking roof peak will be shorter. If you can't decide which angled beams to use, I recommend starting out with the same angled beams as the ones that were used on the original roof edge behind. With that being said, it is more of a guideline. I say this because at the top, you will still have to decide on your own what you want to do, because as you can see, you won't have any of the original roof pieces anymore to guide you. Here are 2 examples that will help you decide what to do at the very top. For the first example, you have a Viking roof peak, which you may have decided is too tall. So in this situation, you would switch from 45-degree pieces at the very top to 26 to keep it shorter. Another great example would be when you can't meet up perfectly in the middle, so you have to try different angled beams to meet up nicely. And by the way, meeting up properly in the middle is a great tip for making a realistic looking Viking roof peak. So remember, use the angles on the original roof as a guideline for choosing your Viking roof peak angles, but don't be afraid to change angles if it doesn't look good or doesn't fit your situation, especially at the very top where you won't have any of the original roof pieces left to guide you. Third, you have now chosen where you want to place your angled beams and which angled beams you want to use, but now you have to choose how much you want to turn them. And just like the other 2 factors, the more turns you add, the bigger your Viking roof peak will be. You can get a straight line, where you only turn the first beam out away from the build. Or you can even get a curved line, where you turn each time you place an angled beam. You could also go for something in between, where you stay straight in some parts and turn in other parts. There are many combinations of turns that you could use here, and if you start to combine them with the many combinations of the other 2 steps, you realize that there are many different Viking roof peak shapes that can be made. If you are having trouble finding something that fits your situation best, remember, you can make it easier by leaving one angled beam open on the edge of the roof, staying with the same angles as the roof behind for a guideline, and trying to make it meet up perfectly in the middle instead of overlapping. For even more help, let's go over a few quick examples. For example number 1, I chose my Viking outpost build. First, you can see that I had 3 places to choose from to begin my Viking roof peak, and I chose the one in the middle. I felt the size in the middle would look the most realistic in this situation, and I usually like to leave one angled beam open at the end so that you can still see the regular roof. Second, I chose to begin with the same angled pieces as the roof behind. And third, I chose to turn my angled beams 1 time each to add a little bit of extra size to the overall look and to make a nice smooth curve in the lines. For the second example, I chose my Viking tavern build. The first and second stages here are the same as the first example. I chose the middle option for my connection point out of 3 choices, and I used the same angles as the regular roof behind. Where this method is different from the first example is how I did the third stage, or how I turned the angled beams. This time I went for a straight line instead of a curved line by turning the first piece twice away from the build and then going in a straight line after that with no extra curves. Step number 2, filling in the gaps in your Viking roof peak. Now that you have created the basic shape, you will need to fill in the gaps that were created to finish it all up. There are 4 methods that I use to fill the gaps. All of these methods can be used in combination with one another, but first, let's talk about each of them individually. First, the most simple method is to not fill them at all. You can see here that the Viking Roof peak looks pretty good with the inside open. I typically only use this for small Viking roof peaks or at the end of larger Viking roof peaks though, because the larger the gap, the less this looks good and the more you'll want to use one of the other methods as well. Second, another simpler method would be to fill the gaps with diagonal beams. You will sometimes need to free place the diagonal beams by shift clicking for this method, and sometimes you will have snapping points that are helpful. This is a great method for filling in the gaps in your Viking roof peak, but just like before where we did nothing to fill in the gaps, the larger your Viking roof peak gets, the less this method will look good. My favorite way to use this method is to place one angled beam coming from the center of the roof facing into the Viking roof peak. And then you can combine it with the other strategies. Third, you can also fill the gaps with regular roof pieces. With these roof pieces, you will connect them into the side of the angled beams in your Viking roof peak, so that they fill in the gaps behind them. Although in larger Viking roof peaks, this will not fill in the gaps completely, and you will have to also attach regular roof pieces to the angled beams on the edge of the roof to fill in the rest of the gaps. This method is great and will be responsible for filling in most of the large gaps in your Viking roof peaks. Although this method is also where it starts to get a bit more complicated. Some regular roof pieces will stick out in funny places, meaning that you won't want to use them, and then you're back to having a gap in this place. That means that this method is always combined with other methods so that you can fill in the rest of the gaps that the regular roof pieces cannot fill in themselves. Fourth, the final method for filling in the gaps is using roof peak pieces. To use the roof peak piece, you will just continue the roof line over the gap in your Viking roof peak. After that, you can actually pair regular roof pieces with these roof peak pieces to fill in even more gaps that aren't just on the top of the Viking roof peak. You have three ways that you can pair these two pieces together. First, you can attach a regular roof piece directly onto the bottom of the roof peak piece, and that will fill in a large gap below. This is the most obvious pairing and it fills the most space, but it is quite large, so it won't be useful in smaller Viking roof peaks. The second thing you can do is to attach a regular roof piece into the side of the roof peak piece. This will fill a smaller gap below than in the first solution. This will slide your regular roof piece upwards 1 meter higher than before, which means you can use it in smaller gaps. It also means that if you want to use the regular roof peak piece as a temporary piece, you can now get rid of it because you have regular roof pieces there instead. And third, you can also use the roof peak piece to slide a regular roof piece over 1 meter. Before this, you slid the regular roof piece upwards 1 meter. But now you can actually slide that over to the left or right 1 meter by placing a 1 meter beam in the top of your Viking roof peak. That will give you a snapping point for your regular roof piece. In summary, remember, for very small Viking roof peaks or the ends of very large Viking roof peaks, you can get away with leaving it open or even with just adding a few diagonal beams. But any larger, and you will have to use regular roof pieces and maybe even roof peak pieces to fill in the rest. A combination of the four methods, of which there are many, is highly recommended. Since there are so many combinations, I will now show you a few examples. For the first example, I will show you my longhouse tutorial build. I chose to show this Viking roof peak because it is a great example of the first two methods of filling in the gaps. Number one, you can see that I left some of the space completely open, and number two, you can see that I used angled beams for the rest. I find that these first two methods go very well together, and as I said before, they go well with smaller Viking roof peaks. I even chose to make a fancy line with the angled beams, which can turn out pretty cool if done correctly. For the second example, we will go back to the Viking Tavern build from earlier in the video, but this time we will check out one of the side roofs. I chose to show you this roof because it showcases number 3 and number 4. Number 3, you can see that I used regular roof pieces to line the angled beams until right before the top because they would overlap at the top. Now here at the top, this is where I got to use number 4. You can see that I used a roof peak piece following the roof line to fill in the first chunk of space. After that, I used 2 more roof peak pieces, which are temporary, by angling them each once away from the first one in the middle. I did this so that I could do what I mentioned earlier. Using these temporary roof peak pieces, I placed regular roof pieces into the sides of them. After this, I got rid of the roof peak pieces behind. This method of using a temporary roof peak piece gave me snapping points for regular roof pieces so that they won't overlap at the top. Now you know how to add a Viking roof peak to a roof in Valheim. The next stage is knowing how to detail your roof in Valheim. If you are interested in that, it is the next video in this tutorial series, and you will see a link here once the video is out. If you don't see the link yet, you could subscribe and turn on the bell so that you get notified when the next tutorial comes out. Speaking of, don't forget to leave a like, it helps me out a lot, and also I have other forms of social media if you're interested, and a PayPal if you want to support the channel. Thanks for watching, more coming soon, and as always, have a good one.